Imagine a street mechanic, no degree, no fancy tools, mocked by a millionaire CEO for trying to fix a luxury car with scraps from a coffee cart. But days later, that same crazy fix becomes the foundation of a breakthrough engine system backed by one of the world's top car companies. What if the man everyone ignored held the future of automotive technology in his back pocket? If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us where you're watching from. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Now, let's jump into the story. The city woke up slow that morning. The sky was cloudy but calm, with a soft breeze weaving between buildings. It was the kind of day that made people believe things would run smoothly. But that belief didn't last long. On the corner of 5th and Melrose, traffic was building fast. Horns echoed off buildings as drivers grew restless. At the heart of the chaos sat a matte black Luxera E12, one of the most expensive electric cars on the market. It wasn't moving, not an inch. Inside the car was Camden Dalen, a well-known tech executive and investor. Known for his sharp mind, sharper tongue, and a string of high-profile product launches, Dalen wasn't used to being stuck, especially not in public. He had a keynote speech scheduled in under an hour and a city watching his every move. This breakdown wasn't just a delay, it was an embarrassment. He stepped out dressed in a crisp suit that looked like it had never seen dirt. Tapping his smartwatch and pacing the sidewalk, he muttered into his earpiece, trying to get a tow or a technician. But no one was close enough to reach him in time. A small crowd began to gather. Some recognized Dalen. Others were just curious. Phones came out. Recordings started. In the middle of this growing attention, a man pushed a squeaky cart past the traffic. He wore a weathered cap, oil-stained gloves, and a jacket that had seen too many winters. His name was Joran Vale, but around the neighborhood, most people just called him the Whisperer. Joran wasn't a mechanic by trade. He fixed things, anything and everything, from radios to scooters to old microwaves. He didn't ask for much and never charged more than he thought was fair. What made him stand out wasn't just his skill, it was the way he worked. Quiet, focused, and always with a strange mix of parts that somehow made broken things work again. He looked at the stalled Luxera, then at Dalen. Without a word, he approached the car. "Back off," Dalen snapped, his voice sharp. "This isn't some beat-up pickup. It's a $200,000 piece of engineered art." Joran didn't flinch. He looked at the engine compartment, then knelt down beside it. "You're not a certified tech," Dalen added, now half laughing, half irritated. "This thing's locked down tighter than a bank vault. You're not going to fix it with a wrench and a prayer." But the crowd was watching, and some, curious, began to film. Joran asked calmly, "Mind if I try?" Dalen shook his head, smirking. "You want to embarrass yourself in front of the internet? Be my guest." The hood was already half open from Dalen's earlier attempts. Joran reached into his cart and pulled out a few odd items: a rusted copper wire loop, a soda can tab, and what looked like a piece from an old headphone jack. People in the crowd exchanged confused glances. Without speaking, Joran got to work. His hands moved with practiced ease, adjusting the wiring inside the panel, wrapping the copper in a precise loop, and slipping the headphone piece between two contacts. There were no dramatic sparks, no grand gestures, just quiet focus. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dash lights blinked. The startup chime rang out. The engine hummed to life, clean, smooth, and steady. Smoother than it had sounded when Dalen first drove up. The crowd gasped. Someone dropped their coffee. Another person whispered, "How did he do that?" Dalen's mouth hung open. He stepped forward, staring at the dashboard, then at Joran. What did you do?" Joran stood up, dusted off his hands, and simply said, "Sometimes the fix isn't in the manual." He started to walk away, cart in tow. "Wait!" Dalen called out, still stunned. "What's your name?" "Joran," he replied over his shoulder, and just like that, he disappeared into the flow of foot traffic. Within minutes, videos from the scene started circulating online. The tags were simple: street mechanic, miracle fix, Luxara breakdown, tech CEO owned, Joran the Whisperer. One clip hit 100,000 views by noon. By evening, it was on every trending page. Car forums, tech blogs, even mainstream news picked it up. Some people called it luck. Others said the car probably just rebooted. But a small group of engineers, watching the clip, noticed something different. They saw the loop Joran used, the placement of the headphone jack, and one person in particular recognized it all too well. Her name was Kelsa Rin. She was a systems engineer at a rising car tech company, and what she saw in that short clip wasn't a fluke. It was a piece of a concept buried years ago, a design shelved before it had a chance. And somehow, a man with no lab coat, no badge, and no budget had made it work, on the street, with scraps. What happened next would change the future of automotive engineering. But it all began on a cloudy morning, with a glitch, a crowd, and a mechanic who didn't follow the rules. The city buzzed louder than usual the next day. Overnight, dozens of videos of the street mechanic's unexpected fix had flooded social media. Clips showed a man in worn clothes, bent over a luxury car, using scrap parts to bring it back to life. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. They replayed the footage again and again. News headlines started to pop up. Mystery mechanic stuns tech CEO. Engine whisperer goes viral. Luxury car brought back to life with soda can and copper wire. Joran Vale had returned to his usual spot behind the coffee cart. He didn't have a phone. He wasn't online. He didn't know that he had become the most talked about man in the city. But the people walking by now looked at him differently. Some with awe, some with curiosity, and some, quietly, with doubt. Meanwhile, in a quiet apartment across town, an engineer named Kelsa Rin stared at her laptop in disbelief. She had watched one of the clips more than 20 times. She wasn't interested in the crowd or the CEO's reaction. She was focused on the mechanic's hands, the way he bent the copper, the placement of the wire, the rhythm of his work. It wasn't random, it was intentional, and it was familiar. Years ago, Kelsa had worked on a design for a new kind of energy loop system for electric vehicles. It was experimental, it was efficient, and it had been shut down. The higher-ups said it was too unpredictable, too risky. The plans were shelved, the project was buried. But what she saw in that video was a version of that very system, raw, rough, and improvised, but working. She had to see him, not for fame, not for answers, but to understand how a street mechanic could bring back something even a lab couldn't get off the ground. By noon, Kelsa was at the corner of 5th and Melrose. Joran was sitting on a crate, sipping tea from a thermos, surrounded by a few curious onlookers. She waited until the small crowd moved on. "You fixed that Luxara E12, she said calmly. Joran looked up, nodded once. "Needed a pulse adjustment. Nothing too big." She stepped closer. "What did you use?" He paused. "Copper loop, headphone driver, soda tab, heat regulation from a broken watch coil." She blinked. "You just had those lying around?" "I always carry them," he said. "Never know what a machine might need." "You used a regenerative voltage feedback loop?" she said, half to herself. Joran raised an eyebrow. "That what they call it these days?" She sat beside him. "You don't know me, but I worked on that design 5 years ago. It didn't pass testing. We couldn't stabilize the voltage curve. Joran nodded slowly. You were testing it in a clean environment. Flat power. Predictable variables. Of course, she replied. That's standard. Real engines aren't predictable, he said. They stutter. They strain. I didn't fix it. I adapted it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Can I show you something? She asked. He nodded. She opened her laptop and pulled up simulation software. Together, they recreated his fix digitally. She fed in the inputs: copper conductivity, resistance levels, alternate power draw, stress curves. The program ran the numbers. The result came back clean. No errors. No warnings. The energy feedback loop worked, and it worked better than anything in her lab. You don't realize what you've done, she whispered. Joran looked at the screen. I just listened to the machine. That evening, Kelsa sent the simulation data to a friend at Arento Motors, a respected European car company known for its forward-thinking technology. She didn't explain where it came from. She only sent the numbers. A few hours later, her phone rang. The message was simple. Where did this come from? We want to talk. Meanwhile, the CEO from the day before, Camden Dalen, was doing damage control. The video of him mocking Joran had reached over 2 million views. The public didn't like what they saw. His tone, his arrogance, the way he had laughed. His team pushed him to issue a statement. He agreed, but not to apologize. He called the event a moment of unexpected innovation and credited the mechanic's instincts. He did not mention Joran by name, but people already knew. In back alleys, in workshops, and in chat threads around the world, Joran Vale's name was spreading. Not as a mechanic, not as a technician, but as someone who had done what billion-dollar labs couldn't. Kelsa returned to him the next morning. Arento wants to fly us out, she said. They want to see this in person. Joran hesitated. They'll want you to explain it, she added. You'll have their tools, their engineers. A real lab. Joran thought for a long time. Then he smiled. All right, but I'm not wearing a suit. And so, the man who fixed a luxury car with junkyard scraps was now headed towards something bigger. He had silenced a city. And soon, he might just change the future of every engine on the road. Joran Vale stood at the edge of the airport runway, watching as the Arento jet touched down. His hands were deep in his coat pockets, and his boots were still stained with grease from the morning's repair work. Beside him stood Kelsa Rin, holding a tablet loaded with designs, simulations, and one question that hadn't stopped buzzing in her mind. Who exactly was Joran? Since the video went viral, many had tried to dig into his background, but there wasn't much to find. No business listings, no licenses, no active certifications. Just a name and a string of repairs around the city. But Kelsa had found something else, something buried in an old patent registry, a name that matched. Not Joran Vale, but Elian Mervyn. She hadn't asked him about it yet, but she planned to. And soon, when they boarded the plane, Joran didn't say much. He looked out the window as the city shrank behind him. His face was calm, but his mind was elsewhere. After a long flight, they landed in southern Italy, where Arento Motors had one of its most secretive test facilities. The company was known for its sleek designs and quiet breakthroughs. What most people didn't know was that they also ran a private lab where experimental engine systems were developed years ahead of the public. They were taken to a long, low building at the edge of a coastal hillside. Inside, a team of engineers waited. None wore suits, all wore curiosity on their faces. And every one of them had seen the video. The lead engineer, Marco Vasari, stepped forward. You're the man who silenced a city with scrap metal. Joran shook his hand. I didn't mean to cause a scene. Good, Marco said. Then you'll feel right at home here. We don't chase noise. We chase results. The next few days were a blur of tests, simulations, and design reviews. Joran's feedback loop fix was recreated in the lab using high-grade materials. The results were even better than the street version. Torque was smoother. Power consumption was lower, and the cooling curve was more stable than anything Orento had on record. By day 4, the engineers stopped calling it a hack. They started calling it the veil loop. Kelsa watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction, but she still hadn't asked her question. Not until the evening of day 5. They were walking through the empty test bays after hours. The sun was setting behind the mountains. She finally turned to him. Elion Mervin, she said. He stopped walking. That's your real name, isn't it? Joran didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. It was, he said. Once. You were an engineer, she continued. You worked for a company called Kelbridge Labs. You filed 3 patents before you turned 30. All energy systems, all related to the same feedback theory. You've done your homework, he said. Why'd you disappear? She asked. Joran looked out at the horizon. I didn't disappear. I was pushed out. My last patent was rejected by the board. They said it was flawed. They said it could never work. But a few months later, they filed a new version, slightly modified, and put someone else's name on it. They stole your work. They buried it, he said. I could have fought them, but I didn't have the money, the lawyers, or the energy. I walked away, changed my name, started fixing things that didn't need paperwork. Kelsa was quiet for a long moment. You could have gone back, she said. No one would have listened, he replied. But machines always did. Back at the lab, Orento's legal team had been preparing something behind the scenes, a new patent. One that included Joran as the primary inventor. They had seen enough proof, they had run enough tests, and they knew that this wasn't just a clever fix. It was a breakthrough that could change the way electric engines handled energy for decades to come. The company's founder, Enzo Orento, flew in personally to meet Joran. He was an older man with a quiet presence. He didn't speak much, but after watching a full demonstration of the veil loop in action, he said one thing. You built what we were all trying to imagine. He offered Joran a partnership, not a job, not a title, a partnership. Joran asked only one thing in return, that part of the profits go toward creating community workshops in cities across the world. Places where young minds could tinker, build, and explore without needing permission or a resume. Enzo agreed. The next morning, a press release went out. Orento Motors announced a new energy stabilization system, developed in collaboration with Joran Vale. The internet reacted fast. Some were confused, some were skeptical. But those who had followed the story from the start knew one thing. The man from the street corner was no longer just a mystery. He was a name, a builder, a forgotten mind rediscovered. And while the world had just learned who Joran Vale really was, the truth had been there all along, beneath the toolbox, in the way he worked, in the silence he kept, and in the machines he never stopped listening to. Months passed quietly after the announcement. While the world kept talking about Joran Vale and the breakthrough energy loop, he had already moved on to his next goal. He didn't care much for fame. He wasn't chasing interviews or spotlights. What he wanted was something simple, something he had dreamed about long before anyone knew his name, a place where anyone could build. He found it in a forgotten part of the city, inside an old train depot that hadn't seen passengers in decades. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked, and weeds pushed through the broken floor. But Joran saw what others didn't. He saw possibility. He cleaned it himself, brick by brick, bolt by bolt. He didn't bring in a construction crew or an architect. He brought in the neighborhood. Kids, teens, retirees, former mechanics, and curious minds all came together. They painted walls, rewired lights, rebuilt the workbenches, and gave the place a name. They called it the Idle Spark. It wasn't a school. It wasn't a business. It was a workshop, open to anyone with an idea and the courage to try. People brought broken bikes, busted speakers, drones with missing parts, and wild inventions sketched on napkins. Joran didn't teach with lectures. He taught by asking questions. He showed people how to listen to the machines, just like he had always done. Word of the workshop spread. Small stories turned into bigger ones. Schools asked to visit. Reporters came to see what the buzz was about. But Joran kept things simple. His focus stayed on the people who showed up each morning with grease on their hands and dreams in their heads. Kelsa Rin joined the effort full-time. She left her job in corporate engineering and helped build out the technical side of the workshop. She brought tools, schematics, and access to simulation software that once only lived behind locked office doors. Her energy matched Joran's calm. Together, they made sure the workshop never lost its purpose. One day, a boy named Malik arrived with a broken electric scooter and a question. He asked if it was true that Joran had fixed a luxury car with a soda can. Joran smiled, knelt beside him, and said, "Not the whole car, just the part nobody else could understand." Malik stayed every day after that. Soon, more workshops started popping up across the country. Orento Motors kept their word. Part of the profit from the Vail Loop patent went directly into building spaces like the Idle Spark in other cities. Los Angeles, Detroit, Atlanta. Each workshop carried the same mission: to give people a place to build, repair, and invent without needing approval or a degree. The automotive world continued to change behind the scenes. Manufacturers began adapting Joran's feedback system into their vehicles. The Vail Loop became the new standard for energy regulation in electric cars. Engineers studied it in universities. Tech companies tried to improve it. But they all knew where it began, on a street corner, with a man who listened before he spoke. Joran never gave another press interview. He rarely attended events. But every once in a while, you'd find him at the back of a classroom or leaning over a workbench with someone who thought they weren't smart enough to build something great. And every time, he'd remind them of the same thing: machines speak. You just have to learn how to hear them. 1 year after the first workshop opened, Joran received a letter. It came from Camden Dalen, the tech CEO who had once laughed at him on the street. The letter was short. There was no apology, just a sentence that read, "You were right, and I was wrong." Joran didn't reply. He didn't need to. The letter was tucked into a drawer next to the copper wire and soda tab he had used on the Luxara E12. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder, not of revenge, but of what happens when you trust your hands, your mind, and your purpose. One afternoon, Kelsa walked into the workshop and found Joran standing by the open door, watching the kids fix a remote-control car. She asked if he ever imagined it would come to this. Joran thought for a moment. Then he said, "I never imagined the world would listen, but I always knew I'd still be building." And just like that, he turned back to the workbench where a young girl was struggling with a tangled circuit board. He didn't take her tools. He sat beside her and waited, because sometimes the greatest breakthroughs don't start in labs. They start with a question, a mistake, and someone who refuses to walk away when the rest of the world stops believing. This was the workshop that rewrote the road, and it all began with one man who never stopped listening.